Thank you for staying with us on Sunday Live. As you saw earlier, I am in the studio with the Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary, Dr. Korir Sing'oei. I'm curious, initial thoughts on the breaking news this evening that U.S. President Joe Biden says he will not be seeking re-election.
Well, I think that's such a massive development. Of course, we follow very keenly what is going on in the U.S. in terms of their forthcoming elections. We know that, the two parties are very, very strong, and, we just wish them well. We wish the Democratic Party well. We wish the Republican Party well. Either way, we will maintain our very close relationship between Kenya and the United States.
Okay.
Yeah.
So to the matter at hand, you wrote a letter this past week to the Ford Foundation seeking information on grants, and I believe you talked about an unexplained amount of 194 million shillings, but in total you said between April 2023 and this, what was it, May or June? I need to check.
It's the last month.
Yeah, the last month, 752 million shillings. What motivated that letter?
So let me just give you a bit of context in terms of the non-profit sector. So the non-profit sector in Kenya is a very important sector. The reports of the NGO sector issued by the NGO Council, for example, in 2022, says that Kenya received, through the NGOs, it received 175 billion shillings. In 2023, Kenyan NGOs received 196 billion shillings. Now, if you contextualize that, Olive, that amount of money is almost like half what we give to county governments in terms of shareable revenue every year. And this money, or these monies, are off budget. That means our government has no sight of it as such, except when these organizations report back to the NGO Council. And so these amounts are in fact based on the reports made by NGOs themselves to the NGO Coordination Board. And so we have a huge amount of money that comes into the country through NGOs or to NGOs, which government really has no way of tracking and understanding in detail the purpose for which the funds, are deployed. Now, when it comes then to the Ford Foundation, as you know, we have a very long relationship with the Ford Foundation.
Just a quick one before we get into the Ford Foundation, but the PBO Act does provide for audited accounts to be submitted. So Indeed. How then does the government not know where this money is going? Indeed.
As a matter of fact, not every organization submits these audited reports. As a matter of fact, in the year 2023, only 2,829 NGOs submitted their audited reports. In the previous year, there were actually more NGOs that submitted reports. So even the figures I'm giving you are not necessarily accurate. But the point I'm making is that when you submit audited reports, you're submitting after the fact. Like the activity has taken place, and now it's been audited, and then eventually handed in. So the activity has already taken place. So coming back to the Ford Foundation, I was saying we have an excellent relationship with the Ford Foundation as the government and the Kenyan people, a relationship that has been in place for the last 60 years. We have a cooperation agreement since 1968 with the Ford Foundation. Ford Foundation is one of the unique NGOs in Kenya, or operating in Kenya and in East Africa, because it has quasi-diplomatic character. What do I mean by that? I mean it enjoys privileges and immunities that are almost similar to a diplomatic mission. Number one, its staff are tax exempt, which is something that only diplomats get. It can import goods and services without paying duty. And under the cooperation agreement, there is a provision that requires that when government makes a request for information, Ford Foundation will place at the disposal of government any information that would help government understand, the nature of its funding, so to speak. And so, based on that cooperation agreement, what we have observed, again based on information that Ford Foundation itself has posted on its site, we've not actually gone to the accounts of these organizations at all. So based on what Ford says, just over the last 1 year alone, about 700 and almost 800 million shillings have been disbursed to these organizations. 800 million shillings to about 16, 17 organizations. Now, over the last 2 months alone, around 200 million shillings have been disbursed to them, or projects have been approved to them. And so what the letter seeks to ask is to say, listen, now we've had, and I think the letter explains that, we've had protests in Kenya, and we are seeing that these protests are powered quite a great deal, of course, by young people, but they're also powered very strongly and aggressively by these civil society organizations. And so we are asking Ford Foundation really just for information about, give us an idea what exactly these projects are.
So they responded. They said this information is freely available on our website.
No, they haven't.
They posted a statement on their website.
That's a statement, okay? I wrote them on behalf of government a letter based on our cooperation agreement. We expect Ford Foundation to respond formally through the normal channels of communication. So I'm sure they put out a small statement to the media just to say, listen, all the information is out there. But certainly, that information out there doesn't contain the details that we are asking for, in terms of providing us the content on, what are these projects about, what are the proposals, who are the beneficiaries, and are you monitoring to make sure that you are not in violation as Ford Foundation of your non-lobbying policy? Because under US law, Ford Foundation and its money is not supposed to be deployed to carry out lobbying activities, whether in the US itself or in third countries. So really, it's a conversation between us as Kenya government and the Ford Foundation. And it's a request for information, it's a request for accountability, and it's a very respectful conversation.
But shouldn't you have sought this information before the president stood and spoke in public and accused the Ford Foundation of sponsoring anarchy? Is it not putting the cart before the horse?
This information is clarificatory in nature. The president spoke based on the fact that we determined that all this money, had been disbursed to these organizations. And therefore, without a full explanation, one would be able to perhaps reach the conclusion that perhaps there is a nefarious purpose. And that's why we are seeking this clarification, because we believe that the work the Ford Foundation has done in Kenya is important, it's significant, it's been positive, it has supported organizations, including government itself. But we want to make sure then that with regard to these grants, that those grants are not being abused, perhaps even unbeknown to Ford Foundation itself. Because
you preempt my next question, what motive would they have for sponsoring nefarious activities in Kenya? Like you said, they've been here since, you've had a cooperation agreement since 1968.
I would not want to imagine that they have any nefarious purpose. But I think, Olive, you're not a stranger in Kenya. You do understand that even when it comes to actors that ordinarily are not political, that there is a chance that they might be prosecuting a political agenda that as it evolves appears to even be going outside the remit, of our Constitution. Okay, so Ford Foundation itself might actually be quite innocent, and that's why we are saying, are you sufficiently monitoring the way in which the resources that you've put out are being used and deployed? That's really what we are trying to establish, so that together we can be able to make sure that these vast, important resources that are employing many Kenyans are put to good use to develop our country. Because like I told you, these resources are off budget. The government has no proper sight of them. It cries out for the same accountability that NGOs, and the Kenyan public is asking the Kenyan government. So
you've been in the civil society space. Last night I hosted John Githongo Irungu Houghton on this set, and they said it takes 6 months, 8 months before a grant is even approved. So to them, they said it's not logical. They went on to say that Kenya itself has been a beneficiary of the Ford Foundation. You talked about the cooperation agreement, and they have funded development projects in the country. Kenyans went mining and found that the First Lady's Joiwo has been funded by Ford Foundation. They found a photo of you, a post you posted with the regional director. And so have you been consorting with the enemy?
Quite to the contrary. And I think the problem, Olive, is that we tend in this country to jump too quickly to conclusions because of the toxic environment of suspicion that we operate within. Nobody actually read the letter in its fullness, the letter that I issued to Ford Foundation. The letter was very clear. It commended Ford for the support. So in a way, I was actually acknowledging that they've supported many organizations. You're right, they put 110,000 US dollars, which is about 11 million Kenyan shillings on Joiwo Foundation. They put 50 million, US dollars to the former First Lady's, organization. I mean, they have supported all these organizations, to enable them discharge their various functions. But that's not to say, Olive, that if you've done 5 roads well, okay, you're therefore immune from being questioned with regard to 3 roads that may not have been done well. So the point we are really asking is, are you paying sufficient attention to make sure that the resources that you've given to these organizations, whose conduct we are a bit concerned about, are being put to proper use?
But isn't there a PBO authority which falls under the Ministry of Interior, which ideally should be engaged in this?
I mentioned to you, and you're completely right, it's a shared function. But I mentioned to you that Ford Foundation enjoys a quasi-diplomatic status. We, the State Department that I serve under, is in charge of privileges and immunities. So we are actually the ones that continue to track those organizations that enjoy this status with a view to ensuring that the status is not being in any way abused, and that Kenyan people are getting value and benefit from the fact that they're actors that are tax exempt, who ordinarily ought to pay tax but are not, because they're giving a social good, a social benefit to the country.
So civil society organizations reacted yesterday and continue to react today. And they take the view, and having listened to you, if you're not sure that these grants were accorded with nefarious purposes in mind, is this then not an attempt to stifle the civil society space?
Is there, if I may ask you, is there a problem in asking for accountability? How does that constitute stifling?
The view is that this is a Moi-era tactic where dissent.
Have those organizations been targeted in any way? Have their accounts been closed? Have their officers been arrested? Not at all. We are having dialogue here with a view to ensuring that whatever resources are invested in this country, whether by donors or international partners, serve the Kenyan people and help us meet sustainable development goals and targets that we've set for ourselves as government. That's all.
I'll put a pin in that for the time being. Now, part of the conversation we're having now as a country, and the point of view that many are saying is that government is looking for a scapegoat, that this protest cannot have been funded, that it was a reaction to what Kenyans viewed as their voices not being heard, where the finance bill of 2024 is government looking for a scapegoat.
I think it would really be unfortunate for anybody to imagine the government is looking for a scapegoat. When the protests broke, I think the reality is that government did not anticipate this level of anger and the level of outrage that people had. With respect to the tax measures the government had proposed, government believed very strongly that it had communicated adequately about the fact that it was carrying a heavy debt burden, and that debt burden needed to be shared, with Kenyans, and that the painful measures that the government was proposing were in order to help it address these challenges. But of course, government was probably wrong. And in ameliorating that wrong, the president, number one, he listened. He vetoed the finance bill. He has put in place serious austerity measures. He has eliminated budgets associated with the offices of the First Lady, the Second Lady, the office of the Prime Cabinet Secretary's, spouse. He has asked all the ministries, all the state departments to reduce their budgets. The development budget has been brought down. So there are major measures that have been taken. Additionally, coming hot on the heels of those measures, I think you've seen then that the president took the unprecedented decision to dismiss his cabinet, to accept the resignation of the Commissioner of Police in view of the criticism around the conduct of the police. He's gone out of his way to communicate through social media with Gen Z. He's invited them to dialogue. So he's done a lot of things to be able to assuage the anxiety of our young people, so to speak. So I don't think he's trying to deflect that burden at all. I think he's owning it up, and he's trying to respond fairly rationally. I think the challenge is because there is a gap, there is a chasm, there is a trust deficit, so that anything the president does or says is not seen as a good faith gesture necessarily, when in fact it's coming from a place of good faith.
So you acknowledge that the protests were triggered by the finance bill of 2024 and the parliamentary vote?
That is what I acknowledge.
Mm-hmm. So then where does the Ford Foundation come in then?
Where does Ford Foundation come in? It comes in because even in the context of the finance bill, and granted, young people were leading this protest movement, but part of the capacity support for that movement was done a lot by civil society organizations, which is okay, all right? The problem, though, is beyond the finance bill. In the aftermath of the finance bill, what we have seen is advocacy that now seems to, or appears to, go outside the remit of the law. So for example, advocacy to occupy State House, for example. What would that lead to? Okay, advocacy to occupy occupy Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. What would that lead to? And if this is getting the support of civil society organizations that are funded by Ford Foundation, isn't it then fair to say...
So you say if. So there's no proof that these organizations that are listed here are those calling for Occupy, State House, Occupy JKIA. Have you tied any of these organizations to those calls?
I think there is a body of evidence, that exists. And we will have that discussion with Ford. We'll be able to show them that we think that this organization or the other organization could have gone beyond the remit of the law, and therefore, not only are they in violation of our law, but they possibly could also be in violation of Ford's standard operating procedures.
Are you essentially telling the Ford Foundation not to fund these institutions?
Is it a
threat?
It's ultimately the choice of Ford Foundation about whom they fund. But certainly, if an organization, for example, if an organization has been found to be supporting terror, for example, and you're a financier of that organization, then you're complicit in that act of terror, are you not?
But you would have to tie these organizations to activities that you say
all I can tell you is that everything we have said is not being said lightly, it's not being said casually, nor is it necessarily intended to say that Ford has knowingly supported a particular activity.
So isn't the onus then on government, not the Ford Foundation?
The onus is on Ford Foundation to provide us with the information that we have asked of it. On that basis, we can be able then to make further determinations.
Okay, I'll put a pin in that. Part of the austerity measures that had been proposed in the budget speech of 2024 is restriction on foreign travel. There was an advisory issued on June the 29th, 2023, to ministries and state departments. So what additional measures would have come into play or have come into play?
I think the austerity measures cut across board. But the reality is that, the State Department that I work under is in charge of advancing our foreign policy, our interests abroad. It's in charge of mobilizing foreign direct investment in the country, to the country. It's in charge basically of building relationships. And so we are much more adversely affected than anybody when it comes to travel, for example. Any serious cuts made on travel would have a disproportionate impact on the State Department of Foreign Affairs. However, having said that, I think the biggest impact will be on the sizes of delegation. We will fundamentally really reduce the delegations to bare bone numbers, just to be able to carry forward some of these functions. Additionally, we will consider very seriously which of these events are truly critical and must be attended by the president in his person, because that has an additional sort of cost, or which are these where the Prime Cabinet Secretary and Foreign Minister can represent him, which are these that, that at my level I can represent, which are these where the ambassador based in a particular capital can be able to represent. And so we are engaged in that, sort of rationalization exercise, and then we are also leveraging on technology. The president can be able to send in, he can be able to send in a recorded message, he can be able to participate virtually. But foreign engagement is a contact sport. It requires that you build relationships. Some of those you can achieve from a distance, but a lot of them you can only achieve through actual engagement.
So we will not see the president flying out of the country as frequently as we have been?
Perhaps not. And I think, in fact, the visits were beginning to reduce, because in the first year of his term, obviously, he was also building contacts, and there was a lot of demand for him. People wanted to hear his voice. People wanted to understand Kenya's perspective with regard to issues such as climate, with regard to issues such as, reform of the financial architecture, with regard to issues around debt. People wanted to hear, President Ruto's views, and I think by and large he's been able to set the tone. He's been able to provide his perspective, and so there is a sense in which some of these meetings he might not be able to attend in person. So there will be quite some reduction in that regard.
All right. We've had the PS Foreign Affairs, Korir Sing'oei, in studio. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. We take a break on Sunday Live, but coming up...